Microbiology. Microbiology is the branch of science that focuses on microorganisms, microscopic organisms that live as single cells or in multicellular forms. Unicellular organisms include bacteria, archaea, and protozoa. Multicellular organisms include molds and multicellular microscopic algae, and also includes viruses which are acellular. The first observation related to cell theory was made by Robert Hooke in 1665. This English scientist examined a thin slice of cork under a simple microscope and described the smallest structural units of life as little boxes, which he called cells, from the Latin word for small chambers. As he later used an improved microscope, he was able to see individual cells more clearly. His discovery laid the foundation for what we now know as cell theory. The idea that all living organisms are composed of cells as their basic unit of structure and function. Just a few years later, in 1674, a Dutch scientist named Antony van Leeuwenhoek made another groundbreaking discovery. Using a basic microscope of his own design, he became the first person to observe microorganisms. This became a key moment in the history of microbiology, even though people at the time still had very little understanding of the role microbes played in disease, fermentation, or ecology. In a series of letters to the Royal Society between 1676 and 1677, Leeuwenhoek described various observations starting with rainwater collected in a container lined with a blue coating. He discovered tiny living creatures, which he said were 10,000 times smaller than the water fleas described by Swammerdam. He went on to examine water from rivers, wells, and the sea. One of his samples came from a well in his own yard, which looked perfectly clear and cold. In a single observation, he estimated more than 500 microorganisms in just a tiny volume of water, and he noticed the number grew when the water was left to stand for several days. However, his most famous observations were related to pepper infusions. On April 24, 1676, he soaked about 1/3 of an ounce of whole pepper seeds in melted snow water for 3 weeks. When he examined the water under the microscope, he saw an astonishing number of tiny living organisms of various shapes. 2 days later, he repeated the experiment using half an ounce of pepper seeds and found hundreds to thousands of microorganisms in a single drop, including very coarse, barely visible forms. Today, the adult human body is made up of about 30 trillion human cells and houses even more bacterial cells, estimated at around 40 trillion. Still, when most people hear words like bacteria or virus, they immediately think of harmful or disgusting things. It's an understandable reaction, especially considering how microbes have been linked to devastating outbreaks throughout history, such as the Black Death, a plague that swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa between 1347 and 1351. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted via fleas carried by rats, this pandemic killed between 75 to 200 million people, wiping out around 30 to 60% of Europe's population. However, not all microorganisms are harmful. In fact, many are essential to life. We rely on microbial fermentation to make food safer and more durable. The human microbiome, the community of microbes living on and inside our bodies, plays a major role in keeping us healthy, particularly in our digestive systems, where probiotic bacteria support nutrient absorption and immunity. In aquatic ecosystems, microorganisms form the foundation of the food web in oceans, lakes, and rivers. Soil microbes decompose organic matter and fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into organic compounds, helping recycle nutrients through soil, water, living organisms, and the air. Some microbes are even responsible for photosynthesis, producing the food and oxygen that sustain life on Earth. Beyond that, microbes are also used in industrial processes to produce vitamins, organic acids, enzymes. Before microorganisms were discovered, all living things were simply categorized into either the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom. Even as late as the 19th century, many scientists believed in spontaneous generation, the idea that life could arise from non-living matter. People once believed frogs emerged from moist soil, flies from manure, and maggots from rotting meat. This belief was first seriously challenged in 1668 by Francesco Redi, who placed rotting meat in both open and sealed jars. Maggots only appeared in the open jars, where flies could lay eggs. In a follow-up experiment, he covered the jars with fine gauze that allowed air to enter but kept flies out, and again, no maggots developed. Still, many scientists insisted that microorganisms, at least, could still form spontaneously. John Needham supported this theory by boiling chicken broth and sealing it only to find microbes appearing afterward. He concluded that they must have arisen on their own. But Lazzaro Spallanzani countered this claim by boiling the broth after sealing it, which resulted in no microbial growth. Needham disagreed, arguing that the heat Spallanzani used had destroyed a supposed vital force, a mysterious life-giving essence thought to be necessary for life to arise spontaneously. He also claimed that sealing the container prevented this force from entering, which is why no life appeared. In other words, Needham argued that spontaneous generation didn't fail because it was wrong, but because the conditions weren't right for the vital force to act. Eventually, this speculative argument lost ground. Especially after Louis Pasteur conducted experiments that clearly showed microorganisms came from the air, not from non-living matter. He also demonstrated that microbes were responsible for food spoilage, which encouraged scientists to investigate how microbes might also be responsible for diseases. At first, the germ theory of disease faced strong resistance. For centuries, illnesses were seen as punishments for sins or caused by evil spirits. The idea that invisible creatures could travel through the air or cling to objects was hard for people to accept. But as evidence grew, the scientific community began to change its views. In 1865, Pasteur investigated a disease affecting silkworms and discovered it was caused by a protozoan parasite, building on earlier research by Agostino Bassi. He also developed a method to identify infected silkworms. Koch later identified other deadly pathogens as well. In 1882, he discovered Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the cause of tuberculosis, a highly contagious and chronic lung infection. And in 1883, he confirmed that Vibrio cholerae, first observed by Filippo Pacini in 1854, was the cause of cholera, a severe intestinal disease that spreads through contaminated water and causes extreme diarrhea and dehydration.